Good morning, everybody. It's Andrew Ross Sorkin. Welcome to this week's DealBook Debrief. We're thrilled you could join us. This is our third DealBook Debrief conference call, and we want to thank everybody. We've been even a bit surprised by the success of these thus far. Last week with Maggie Haberman, we had 4,000 people register for the event. It was quite remarkable, and we have another huge turnout today. I'm joined by Jason Karaian, our DealBook editor based in London. We're going to have a conversation this morning about the future of media in the world of COVID and what comes next and what it all means. We're joined and thrilled to be joined by Ben Smith, our media columnist, newly minted media columnist in from BuzzFeed. Also, Ed Lee is joining us this morning, our intrepid media reporter. And as you know, there is so much going on in the media world. Hollywood production is now officially shut down. Sporting events have been canceled. Advertising is in a nosedive. Podcast listening is down. And on the other side, streaming services are having record viewership. Services like Quibi just launched this week, and we'll talk about all of that and more, as well as the future of the news business. You can submit questions at any time during this event using the Q&A window. I should mention this is an audio-only call, so if you're looking for video, you won't necessarily get to see our beautiful mugs, but you will get to listen to us. And we do that so that if you want to do some work along the way, we can try to make this easy. I should say this is being recorded. We'll make the replay available in DealBook's newsletter tomorrow and available on the website and through social. I also want to let everybody know that we're going to do a special call next Tuesday called the DealBook Helpline, which is going to be really to help entrepreneurs and folks who are sole proprietors and startups think through some of the issues that COVID is creating in terms of navigating your business. We're going to be joined by some experts to talk about some real just general practical advice about what you can do with employees, how you renegotiate rent, how to deal with some of these SBA loans and other things. But right now, I want to get to the conversation of the morning, which is the future of the media world. And I thought I'd start, Ben and Ed, with this, which is actually talking a little bit about your former employers in a way, because in a way, they may encapsulate sort of the issues that are confronting the media industry more than any other. Ben, you just came from BuzzFeed, and Ed, in your prior life, were Recode, which is part of Vox, and in an environment that's digital and based on advertising. I think there are real questions about what the future of all of this looks like. So I'll start with you, Ben. How do you see it?
Thanks, Andrew. I thought I was going to be like a source, not a target here, but yeah, I mean, I think as you say, I mean, if you're the extent to which you're exposed to the advertising industry is the extent to which you're screwed right now as a media business. I mean, there are lots of other problems too, but businesses that are, heavy on advertising, I think are just feeling it from all over the economy. So that's most of the digital media companies. They're probably a little less than they would have been 2 or 3 years ago, where they really had no other businesses. But another big business for BuzzFeed, commerce, is also, I think, a little in question right now.
Commerce is, Ben, that's where BuzzFeed sells items at Walmarts and whatnot, right? That was part of how BuzzFeed diversified its business into outside of advertising.
Yeah, that's right. I mean, it's a big business for the New York Times too, at Wirecutter.
Right. And just to identify voices, Ben was the first voice, Ed was the second voice, and Jason, throw your voice in and say hello too, just so everybody.
Hi there. I'm here too.
Beautiful.
I'm here
okay.
Too.
Anyway, back to the scheduled programming. Ben, go at it.
Yeah. So, but I think the big questions are, to what degree will advertising come back? I don't think there's any question that like Amazon won't be there to do commerce transactions, when this thing is over. But I think these companies are, in for a really, tough summer at the very least, and that they've already started to cut costs in various ways.
Ed, on a similar note, you've written about the proposition that ultimately there's going to be a need to consolidate. Do you see that happening in the midst of all of this?
Well, there was a need to consolidate before all this was going on, right? BuzzFeed, as big as it is in terms of how it's built its business, Vox Media, as big as it has gotten after it gobbled up New York Magazine, that was a deal last year, and all these others, they're still not big enough, right? So they all recognize that, and they're all still dancing around each other in terms of, well, can we get together on a deal? Can we consolidate? Why would that benefit them anyway, right? Well, you have a bigger audience altogether. You come with a bigger slice of the pie. You can negotiate better deals with advertisers and everyone else. So that's where that was the thesis behind that. Now, like more than ever, I feel like, that's kind of necessary. I was talking to someone just yesterday, a competitor, CEO at a rival digital publisher, and he was like, this is a Darwinian moment, right, for digital media, right? In terms of, we could now see who's really valuable and who's really not. Not to say that, they weren't valuable before, but, what's that Warren Buffett sort of metaphor, right? Like the sea comes back and then you can see who's not wearing any, who got no clothes on. So Ben's right, the degree to which that they're exposed to advertising, but BuzzFeed and Vox Media and some others have been smart about diversifying, right? Sort of finding other sources of revenue. Someone at Vox Media was telling me the other day that that they're glad that they cut those big video deals. They have deals with like Hulu and Netflix and also Quibi. Those aren't going away. They're still getting paid for those. So that's actually sort of helped them a little bit. Also, if you're in the media business and you have a subscription side of it, as the New York Times does, New York Magazine apparently is doing pretty well with their sub business. So is like the Atlantic, right? So, there's a two-sided effect to coronavirus, right? If you're super exposed to advertising, you're kind of screwed. But if you have a subscription business or started one even recently, you're seeing some benefits there. So,
Right.
That's where, that's how it's been shaking out.
Ben, let me ask you though about the subscription business, because you wrote a great piece just a week ago about the news industry, the newspaper industry. And a lot of the newspaper industry, though, does have a subscription element to it, but it clearly has not been enough to keep these papers afloat. I also think of the magazine business. I mean, I think there could be a reckoning when it comes to the magazine industry. Companies like Condé Nast were challenged before this. What do you think comes next?
Yeah, I mean, it's amazing because the big newspaper chains have used to have a really large print subscription business. And they really, and again, I think it's often hard to know, or it's easy for people like me to say that it was mismanagement and incompetence rather than just them being doomed. But, they have, I think that Gannett's 250 papers combined have something like a tenth of the subscription numbers of the New York Times, which is just crazy. Like the sort of failure of those to build digital subscription businesses. And it's, and so they're just operating at a tiny scale and really, really struggling now mostly because they're competing with the New York Times and the Washington Post and the Wall Street Journal, but with these tiny little newsrooms and hollowed out tech. And it's just very difficult for anybody except the biggest winners to compete in that business. I do think it's tough for magazines too. I mean, you think about the history of it, and Vanity Fair in particular, which got huge in the 1920s, and then I guess it kind of got the Nazi story wrong. They thought they were stylish, but was not really built for the 1940s and folded then. And I think what is that magazine right now? Is I think a real question editorially as well as commercially. Who's subscribing?
Let me pivot the conversation a little bit to big media for a second. And Ed, I'll go to you. You looked at the valuations of a lot of big media companies come down. I'm thinking of CBS Viacom, which was only down to about $8 billion about a week ago. I know it's come up a little bit. Big questions about advertising there. By the way, also big questions about production. Most dramas and comedies are effectively out of business. And as we know, the sporting industry is out of business right now.
So the CBS part of Viacom CBS, I mean, they were always the stronger side of the business. But now, because they don't have sports, no one has sports, they're losing hundreds of millions of dollars. They lost close to $300 million just on the cancellation of the NBA a few weeks ago. So just in this short period of time, just losing that already resulted in hundreds of millions of dollars of lost advertising. The thing is, Viacom CBS, they're an interesting spot, right? So they merged late last year. They closed it around November, December. And when they did that, they announced, well, you know what, we're seeing about $500 million in cost savings from this merger. And then a few weeks later, they said, actually, it's going to be more like 700 or 800 million in cost savings. So that was already part of the merger calculus. Now, like even just a few weeks after that, with COVID happening, all the other big media companies are either furloughing or laying people off or cutting back salaries for the big executives. Viacom CBS, sort of the timing was kind of perfect for them almost, where it's like, well, we're already planning on making these cuts, so we're going to continue to do them. Whether you want to call it COVID-19 cuts or merger cuts, like they're still the same cuts. So in a weird way, like they've sort of kind of benefited from that timing, as terrible as that sounds. But you're right, like there's also less money coming in, right? Paramount, their film studios stopped production, as is everyone else in Hollywood. So no one's really producing anything. And there's no more production on entertainment, and there's no sports. Those are the two things that drive pretty much all the big media companies. Now it's just a matter of who's got the better balance sheet. Viacom CBS had a pretty bad balance sheet. They're highly levered to begin with. So in a way, they're vulnerable. The only sort of, beyond sort of the pre-planned cost cuts, the only sort of stopgap they have is Sherry Redstone, right? She's the person in charge. She's the person who controls the company. She controls all the voting shares pretty much. She's not ready to kind of sell it off anytime soon. She's not ready to break it off anytime soon. She just spent the last 2 or 3 years pulling it back together. So I've heard she's willing to ride this out for as long as she can before she has to do something drastic, like sell a piece off or close down entire divisions. So, you know, that they've already built in these cost cut ideas, and that, you know, you've got a controlling shareholder, you know, they've got a little bit of leeway, they've got a little bit of room. That said, $10 billion, I mean, they're worth a third of what they were when they merged, right? So it's still not great if you're a shareholder. You know, I'm sure a bunch of them are pretty upset and wanting to figure out what their next step is.
What about AT&T, which obviously made a big play by buying Time Warner? They're going to be reintroducing this HBO Max product. It's a highly levered company. What's the impact?
Yeah, so AT&T is a balance sheet company, right? So they have a lot of cash flow. They also borrow a lot of money. There's dividends, there's buybacks. So they cut back on their buybacks, right? That they said, you know, we're going to slow down the buyback program, but they're still doing dividends. So, and they've also borrowed some more money. So balance sheet wise, they seem like they're okay. The big question mark, as you pointed out, is their Time Warner, their Warner Media acquisition. So what does that mean? They've hung it all on this HBO Max thing, right? That's their streaming service, their Netflix competitor. It's going to come out next month. They still haven't given us a date. They're still sort of scrambling to get the technology right, is what sources have been telling me. And they just hired a new guy, Jason Karaian. He's not new, but he's new to the business. He was the founding chief executive of Hulu. And so he's one of these like streaming pioneers. I think it's like one of the smartest moves AT&T has made. So despite that, there's been all this question mark about like, will HBO Max like compete, you know, enough? Like it's going to be expensive, $15 a month. That's at the higher end of what all the other streaming services charge. So there was a few knocks against them. A phone company buying a media company. Do they know what they're doing? All that kind of stuff. Hiring Jason Karaian, though, I think is one of the smartest moves they've ever made. It was one of the more inspired things that I've seen.
Hey, Ben, content question for you, though, which is if all of these programs are effectively, or all the production schedules are shut down, talk a little bit about, you think, the zeitgeist of the way the world's changing. Obviously, people are watching news like crazy right now. And they're watching Tiger King like crazy right now. But what are they going to be watching this summer if there isn't going to be content available? And do you think that content across the board is going to shift in terms of its relevancy? Do the storylines that might have been in the works a month or 2 months ago even work in a couple of months from now?
I mean, those are different questions. The last one is fascinating and in some creative sense above my pay grade. I mean, you know, it's Netflix in particular has I think says they have a pipeline of content for the rest of the year. Like, I don't think they're not going to be like running dry anytime soon. I do think that some of these streaming services, Disney Plus in particular, you know, launched with big numbers, but and with a huge hit, the Star Wars show, The Mandalorian, and you know, now I don't know. Like, I was watching a really terrible 1970s Disney movie with the with my kids the other night thinking, like, are they going to run out of content here? And I think everybody's sort of burning through all these libraries a lot faster than we would have expected, because there's lots of consumption. So I do think that's a real question. And the change, one of the really interesting things now, I think, is that, celebrities, influencers are sort of improvising and doing really interesting stuff on Facebook. I don't know if you guys saw there was a sort of fake Zoom production of Hamilton that everybody was watching, but there's this very quick turn, kind of zeitgeisty, fun stuff being done by huge, producers and talent and who have nothing better to do, who at some point I suspect are going to want to start charging for that work. And I think that's going to be, it's happening for free on Facebook right now, which is great for Facebook. But I think you might start to see them and their agents who need jobs start to take those projects, which are kind of raw, quicker turn, kind of fun of the moment things, to to all the different streamers to fill these holes.
I'm gonna disagree with you, Ben, a little bit here. I mean, you're right. There's a lot of really interesting user-generated content that's happening. Maybe now more than ever. People stuck at home. I'm watching all these great Twitter feeds of people sort of doing sort of kind of whatever kind of setup they have at home. I saw this one where they, people are did the Simpsons kind of opener. They're stuck at home and they all played the different roles. It's really interesting. My challenge is this, though. I mean, the whole conceit of YouTube to begin with was exactly this, right? You're not going to need professional content anymore because people are going to create their own content, and that's what people really want. They like it, they want it, they watch it. There's advertising, there's money, but no amount of user-generated kind of creativity will produce something like Game of Thrones, right? People still want the professional stuff. They still want the cool sci-fi, whatever, sort of professionally produced content. I just feel like YouTube's thesis is ultimately, it's false. It's not correct. It hasn't really borne out. So, we're still living through this idea of, well, can people do we not need TV production? Do we not need professional media anymore? I think we're going to need it.
Can I agree with that?
Yeah.
Sorry.
Yes.
Yeah, I think that's right. I think when you see, for instance, that podcasts are down, it's people who have a choice between podcasts and Game of Thrones because they're not commuting and are choosing Game of Thrones rather than a kind of easier to produce, cheaper form of content. That said, you have all these, just in this moment, you have all this huge talent who are at home alone with time on their hands making stuff. And I think that stuff will fill some of these gaps. And I think, there's going to be space for both. TikTok is the best thing going right now.
Okay, jump ball for both of you. Quibi, Jeffrey Katzenberg's Quibi launched this week on Monday. You're over under. Both of you.
I'll let Ben jump in on this one first.
So let's see. I think I kind of love it, like unexpectedly myself. I don't know if you've watched Punk'd on it, but it's really pretty good. I have. Yep. And there's a bunch of like pretty good stuff. But I do think that that a launch like that with the kind of money they're spending needed to just like blast into the stratosphere on day one, get a huge amount of attention and chatter, and there's just no space for that. And so I don't really see how they clear the mountain on building the kind of millions and millions and millions of subscribers when it's just hard to get anybody to hear of your company if it is not called coronavirus.
So hey, I have a question for you, Ben, on that. I mean, did you tune into Quibi because you're a consumer in the world who is interested, or because you're a media columnist?
I tuned in because I know Jeffrey Katzenberg. This is like literally the only kind of person I know who uses Quibi, and I know a lot of people know Jeffrey Katzenberg. So that's not.
There you go. So all the chatter that I've seen on Twitter and my timeline or wherever are people who know to some degree, Jeffrey Katzenberg or the whole Quibi enterprise, and got some kind of a screener or something ahead of time and said, hey, we all got the hard pitch, right? And I think Katzenberg's a great pitch man. There's a reason why he's been so successful. But like, I don't know that regular people are going to be like, oh, there's this show that I need, I probably need to watch. And so let's go download this thing and try it out. That's I don't think, from what little I've seen, I haven't really comprehensively looked at everything, but I don't think they have a hit. I think it's going to come down to, do they have a hit or not, right? It's going to come down to the content. You know, their pitch is always, it was this sort of idea of like watching it on your phones in 7 or 10 minute increments. You know, again, it's a commuter service, right? That's no one's commuting. So
yeah, and they need like a massive breakout hit. And I mean, yeah.
So two very quick final questions from me. Then I'm going to hand it over to Jason, who I know has his own, along with so many of your questions, which are coming in fast and furious. You guys had mentioned podcasts just a moment ago. Obviously, listenership is down because the commuter opportunity doesn't exist the way it used to. And in a world of advertising also falling off or nosediving, are you still, I know both of you, I think were relatively bullish on podcasting probably a month or two ago. Does it change the dynamic at all now?
I don't know. That's a tough question.
Yeah, I mean, there's been, I think, I mean, I think it's hard to, it's such a why, it's such, I don't know if I'm bullish or bearish on the podcasting in the abstract. There's been so much investment and such huge bets, particularly by places like Spotify lately, that, I mean, I think everybody in that industry knows that this is a moment of like, there's all this, or this was until quite recently a moment when there's all this money slashing around in a way that probably wasn't sustainable, but that felt like for a few years it was going to be possible to make really amazing stuff and kind of see what stuck. Maybe that period is getting compressed. I mean, I don't think, I think the bet that Spotify is making, that they want a bunch of content they own that they can play out, that people will listen to on their platform, like that hasn't changed. I don't think, I don't think Gimlet's going anywhere, and these huge investments they made. But I do think these companies, like iHeart, that are advertising dependent across their whole business, are trying to shift all their spending into digital. There's just gonna be less money.
I agree with Ben. I think the fact that Spotify has really defined the market size for this thing. They're the ones who really decide like what these podcasting production companies are worth, and they're spending $100 million to buy them. So yeah, there's so much investment that it's not going to go away, certainly, and it's not going to. I don't even think it's going to diminish, even in spite of sort of the lower listening that we're seeing, at least data wise. I think part of it is like podcasting right now, the explosion came through sort of like a structured part of your day. Again, it's a commuter service. I just think because people are so stuck at home, and we're still new at this staying at home thing, people are trying to reorganize their day. And I think at some point, even if we don't go back into offices in even the next few months, people will kind of create their own structure again. And I think they'll probably come back to podcasting, the fake commute at home, almost like, oh, I'm going to wake up and I'll tune into these podcasts I used to tune into, sort of thing. That's just my guess. Yeah.
Okay, final question from me. I just want you to weigh in on today's controversy. We reported it in today's DealBook, and it was in the Times as well. The UFC is going to be running a match on an Indian reservation in California, apparently in 10 days from now. They're doing this because they want to get the money from ESPN, which is required to pay them whether there's an audience or not, meaning an audience, live audience in the room or not. And so that's why they're putting this together. There are people who are screaming and hollering and saying this is completely and utterly irresponsible. As you know, UFC is owned by William Morris, or Endeavor rather, I should say, which is a challenge business that failed to go public last year. Disney owns ESPN. What do you think is going to happen? Do you think they're actually going to go through with this? Should they go through with this?
I mean, I think there are a lot of government officials right now who are looking for an opportunity to take action in public health. And I think if there is any way that a state government can stop them, it probably will. Trump seems to like UFC, so maybe he wouldn't.
I think.
But do you think Bob Iger should allow this to go on?
I think it smacks of it's definitely a Wild West kind of move, right? It's kind of it's not just about ESPN and regulators. It's also just about the wider sporting world. They're all looking at this, Roger Goodell and, Silver, they're all looking at, are they going to do this? Because if they do this, it kind of opens the door a little bit for us to kind of say, oh yeah, September is perfect for the NFL to start. Don't worry about it. or we'll get back to games in the next month or two, something like that. So I think it's the bigger lens is the entire sporting world, and then the media world after that. Like, yes, are you going to do this or not? I think it's a good question on Bob Iger. I mean, I'm surprised we haven't really heard anything there.
Yeah, that's a great question. I also think, right, it's ESPN is desperate to get this content moving again. Disney, though, right now is I mean, their defining issue is going to be that whenever you decide that you want to go on a cruise again, Disney better feel like it's the one brand that's safe. I mean, that is an advantage they have when this thing returns, if they can hold on to it, is that their brand is so much about feeling safe. And at theme parks, that, like when you feel safe going out in public again, Disney World is going to be like the safest place you could be. And I think like this sure cuts against that.
Okay. Well, thank you so much for the conversation, at least this portion of it with me. Jason, jump in.
Hello. Yes. Hi. Thanks. I've got a ton of questions here from listeners. Thank you very much for those. If I could just take my host privilege here to ask the question that I have, because I don't know, I'm sort of the economics guy at DealBook, is that if there is as deep a recession as it looks like we might have, and if these kind of L-shaped recoveries, if there's something approaching the Great Depression, do you think that will lead to people cutting back on streaming subscriptions? There was already a bit of nervousness, I think, around how many different options people have, and cord cutters are now juggling so many of them. And we just talked about Quibi, which just launched, and we have Disney Plus, HBO, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Do you think that there will be a cutting back on those subscriptions if there is a rather bad recession? And then follow up to that would be, who is the sort of stickiest service in that scenario?
So it's a great question. I actually asked around some of these data people that we talked to. S&P did a survey not too long ago that basically asked that question, right? If you lost your job and you want to reduce your household expenses, what are you likely to cancel of like your home costs, your stuff you have to pay for? Streaming actually was the first to go, like compared to like your cable, compared to your internet service and your mobile phone, right? So as it relates to media consumption, streaming was the first, the thing that we're more likely to cut first before even cable, and then of course internet. So that I thought was interesting. Something like 37% said that that's the thing they would be most likely to cancel. Cable was like 28%. So that I thought was interesting. But in terms of what people are willing, least likely to get rid of, like the stickiest, Netflix. I think they're already saturated. It's like 60 million in the US, and it's probably closer to 65 million or 60, something like that right now. And I think, even Netflix said they see the total market size in the US is somewhere between 60 and 90 million. So they're sort of already there. And I think it's going to be, I think Disney Plus has benefited more recently. Quibi's still so new, so I don't really know. But Netflix seems to be the stickiest at the moment. I think the rest of these guys, it's sort of a take it or leave it kind of a situation.
Right. So go ahead, Ben.
I would say that's all, I think, totally right. I mean, I do think you see the logic of bundling. Like if marketing becomes, in the way it did for fast food restaurants recently, like we can give you breakfast for $1, a full breakfast for $1. I think there's a lot of logic to, we'll give you Spotify, Netflix, and the New York Times for something less than the paying for them separately.
Right. So do you think a downturn could accelerate moves to bundle these unbundled services?
I mean, I think it was going to happen anyway, but yeah, probably.
Yeah.
I think Ben's right.
Yeah. And then kind of a follow up there from Dalman, who's on the call, asking about, 50 million subscriptions for Disney Plus. How does that impact Netflix? I think this is kind of a follow up. That's additional for now, right? But you were sort of suggesting that maybe Netflix wins out over the longer term.
Yeah,
at least that's the indication we have.
I don't think that's an either or proposition. I don't think people are buying into Disney at the expense of Netflix necessarily. And that's something Reed Hastings has said over and over again. He doesn't see it as a zero-sum game, and I think he's right. I think surveys have said about, the most on average a household will support is maybe 4 or 5 streaming services at once. Now that's certainly going to be less, right? In this moment. So if it's going to be 2 or 3, I think everyone's got Netflix, and then they're probably adding on either Hulu or Disney or Amazon, or maybe they already have Amazon. So it's a fight for second and third and fourth place. And maybe now it's really just a fight for second and third place. So I think Netflix continues to win. I think it's just a matter of, is Disney winning at the expense of Quibi maybe, right? Or at the expense of Hulu, or at the expense of CBS All Access. There are now so many of these. And then there's also, we forgot to mention, there's a lot of free streaming services like Pluto and Roku TV, which actually those guys have actually done pretty well right now in the last few weeks, because they're free. And if you're trying to limit your expenses, that's an easy way to get some entertainment.
Right. Pivot here. Louis asks, what do you think about the future of small subscription-based newsletters like those hosted on Substack?
So I think that that's a really interesting trend, but I think it's also, they're very small. Like I think there's, if you look, Substack displays the top, like the top newsletters on its homepage, and if you go there, I think that maybe 2 or 3 of them are bringing in enough money that they can employ like 1 or 2 other people, other than other than the main voice writing it. And I think there's a handful of people making a decent living, but it's like nobody has figured out how to take it from, a newsletter that's going to maybe aspirationally make you $100,000 a year to something that could become a business. And maybe they will, but I've actually been a little surprised that you haven't seen stuff accelerate out of Substack into something bigger. Like, it seems like these newsletters are kind of hitting a ceiling. I do think that, it's this moment in every industry, and certainly in media, where talent has all this leverage and power, as Andrew will tell you. And so there is this idea that I think is kind of interesting, that you'll see, in a way, editorial operations change to where the writers are essentially controlling the business, and the service layer of editing and lawyering and marketing is a kind of an agency that serves a powerful Substack writer or something like that. But that still feels pretty far off.
Yeah.
I feel like I agree with that. I mean, I feel like there's also if someone's going to succeed, they're going to succeed because they've somehow developed an audience on their own, and it's really just one person. Maybe they have one support staff or something. I've seen nothing so far that tells me that there's going to be these guys are going to federate in some kind of way, right? Which there have been throughout this relatively short history of the commercial internet, like there's always been these attempts to kind of federate bloggers and stuff, and they kind of come and go, and they ultimately always fizzle out.
I don't know. What wasn't one of them Vox.com?
Right, exactly. So Vox.com
exception proves the rule.
That's actually remains to be seen, but like SB Nation, which is this big sports blogging network out of Vox Media, they've run into issues in the last few years, right? Because they've relied on freelancers and people basically sort of working for free in a lot of cases, and very, very sort of loyal and big fan bases around some of these sites that they've created, but you're not creating any really good structure around it. It doesn't really make sense unless you're one of these big standout people who have thousands or millions of readers. So yeah, it'll always be a one-off thing, I feel like.
Right. Question from Mike. We were just talking about some of the smallest media, quote unquote, companies. Mike asks, should more billionaires purchase newspapers and magazines? He's mentioning like Mark Benioff at Time, for example. Is that a sustainable model?
Really depends on your taste. Like, if you like the things billionaires like and their view of the economy, then it's good. If you think that, if you're a little concerned about that, it might make you nervous.
I think it's again, it really, it's going to come down to who that billionaire really is, right? Is it in the mold of a Bezos, right? Who, when he bought the Washington Post, there were a lot of question marks as to, what kind of influence he might exert. And so far, it seems really none, right? At least not on the content. You could argue the same with the Rupert Murdoch and the Wall Street Journal. I think the Journal has been a pretty astounding paper under his ownership. I don't think it's changed all that much in terms of necessarily the the journalistic direction. But then there's questions or marks around the new owner of the Los Angeles Times, right, Patrick Soon-Shiong, who, he's still new to it, and there's some question marks as to how he's managing that newsroom, if at all, or what kind of influence he's exerting. So it really it's very much a case-by-case basis.
Right. I have a question here from Scott, which I'm going to adjust a little bit. He's asking about how media companies will diversify their revenue streams, which we've talked about a little bit. But going away from the billionaire model, what about the nonprofit model, like the Texas Tribune and these kinds of things? That's another avenue that maybe we haven't discussed yet.
Ben is the expert here.
Yeah, I mean, I do think that when you talk about, and local news is more screwed than anybody else. I mean, almost uniquely more. Like all of the answers that broadcast and that national outlets and larger outlets, have found their way to, and probably post-crisis will continue fumbling toward, really don't seem not to exist in a real way on a local level. And I think most of the most promising things happening are either actual nonprofits or newspapers that have been bought by local rich guys who are taking a loss on them and are willing to. And I think that is really promising. I mean, I think when you look at a place like Indianapolis or like Memphis, like these are cities with real philanthropic bases who give to the opera and give to the ballet. And I think there's increasingly a sense in that kind of community that, like news is an important public utility. I was on the board of the city, the New York City one that's, you should all support. And I think we were able to raise $10 million pretty fast, and you can run a pretty good newsroom for that. And I think there are challenges with nonprofit news. It can be really boring. Like there can be this sense of like, well, we have to do really worthy stuff and no one wants to read that, which is a bit of a problem. And it can, it can be bent to the will of the people paying the bills, which is an issue too. But I think you see models in Texas and elsewhere that are really working. And I think a lot of the sort of most ambitious people in the business now are focused on that. Yeah.
We're running out of time, but quickly, let's get in this question from Alexandra about radio. What about radio? Is there any momentum for them? Is there anything different about radio from the other mediums we've been talking about?
From what I've seen, and some media buyers that I talked to, radio seems to be kind of resilient right now. They've been resilient for a while, even in the face of podcasting and the internet generally. But it's taken a hit advertising wise, as is every other media channel. But interestingly enough, it's like in times of crisis, radio is like one of those emergency communications networks in a lot of ways that people still tune to. I remember that 9/11, people would be sitting in their car with the door open and the radio on, that kind of thing. That was a long time ago, but I kind of feel like there is this weird comfort that radio provides in moments like these. And I feel like it's one of those things that's kind of come back, if anything. I don't know that there's any structural impact just yet on radio because of this, but it seems as essential as it ever has.
Right.
Yeah,
go ahead, Ben.
Oh, sorry, right. And public radio is sort of the pioneer of nonprofit media in this country. The radio though has invested incredibly heavily in podcasting. I mean, iHeart, which used to be Clear Channel, if I'm getting this right, has made these big investments, and then Entercom, which used to be CBS Radio, similarly bought some podcast studios. It's very focused on that now and trying to sort of move their business there.
Right. And then the last question, sorry, we couldn't get to all of them, but a pretty important one that I think we could wrap up on from Jen. Who will the advertisers be during the recession? And, particularly this, virus-induced recession. There's lots of eyeballs reading media and watching streaming, but advertisers are both saving their money, and they're also pretty wary of advertising against the news that they see. Who is going to advertise throughout them?
All I'm seeing everywhere is Masterclass.
I am seeing.
I don't know. I bought it too.
Well, you bought it?
My kid just learned to do magic from Penn and Teller. It was pretty good.
Oh wow! So that's a great
worth
opportunity
it.
Then.
Yeah.
Right. I think the sober answer to that question is insurance. I think Warren Buffett is not relinquishing a dime of ad spend right now. That's for sure. And also streaming. I think streaming, you're going to see a lot more. If you haven't already, Quibi's been everywhere on their ad budget, but I don't think that's going to go away either. And also pharmaceuticals, it's like, and those are already big ad spenders, but they're not going away. So it's
canned food companies.
Canned food companies,
getting grim out there.
Crisis spending.
Right. Well, on that note, I'll hand it back to you, Andrew, to close up. Thanks for everyone, and sorry we couldn't get to all of your questions.
Jason, thank you, and thank you for all your questions. Everybody, please join me in thanking Ben and Ed for this great conversation. We'll let everybody else get to go watch the Cuomo presser right now. Again, just to remind everybody, though, we do have the DealBook helpline call that's going to happen next Tuesday. We'll have more information. We'll have a replay of this call in tomorrow's newsletter. And we should also let you know that if you want to find out more about the full slate of digital events that the New York Times is putting on, including the next installment of DealBook Debrief, you can visit timesevents.nytimes.com. Please stay safe and healthy out there, everybody. We'll talk to you next week.